Hey guys, Travis here. I wanted to do a video today that's a little bit of a class, I guess, if you will, simply for everything that's going on in the world right now. Um, I've been seeing, everybody being affected, but especially within the spiritual community, a lot of people who identify as sensitive or empathic um, seem to be having a little bit of a hard time with this. And I personally have issues with the whole empath thing, anyways, which is a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. It's like, after Dances with Wolves came out, everybody was like a descendant of a Cherokee princess. Now everybody is an empath. So I don't really care for the term, I don't really care for the word, but I do want to talk a little bit about this because there's a lot of ungroundedness that I see floating around out there. So, first off, what is an empath? Um, Kind of going back to like Star Trek days, and then there was like an episode of Charmed, and then later one of the characters kind of developed it on that show. The idea of the empath is someone who literally feels what other people are feeling. Now, that in and of itself, I don't have issue with and I don't disagree with because there are people who are sensitive in that way and to that degree. But the thing is, and part of what kind of drives me crazy, like I said, it sort of seemed to become like popular. Everybody's an empath. Everybody, you know, and in truth, we are all that because empathy is a human trait. So you're not an X-Men, you're not some, super special person if you identify as empathic because in truth, we're all empathic. If you are not empathic, then you'd probably be a sociopath. And that would worry me. So it's fine, but then we sort of label it. It is what it is. We sort of label it as if it's this special gift, and somehow we're all the special gift. It's a kind of is an ego thing a little bit. So that's why I don't particularly like the term, um, but I get it. I also see a lot of stuff with empathy or empathic stuff that is unnecessary, and I think people just think that's the way they're supposed to be or act. And so I guess if you could put a title to this talk or lecture or little class, whatever you want to call it, I would definitely call it Energy Management for Sensitive People. So, people who are sensitive emotionally, energetically, intuitively, psychically, mediumistically, metaphysically sensitive, however you want to look at it, however you want to word it. There's lots of things that they experience in common. One of the things is very sensitive to crowds of people, prone to emotional swings, mood swings. Something else that I've noticed is a kind of a common trait amongst people who are spiritually sensitive is we tend to have I don't know, it looks like a little bit of a predisposition to low blood sugar, depression. A lot of us will experience, we're more introverted, so we'll experience things like social hangovers, loneliness, isolation, burnout, easily um, overstimulated. And two things kind of come up here that are like the biggies that I notice. One is I've never met someone who is genuinely gifted, sensitive, in tune, aware, who has not dealt with or suffered with anxiety in sort of a chronic way, at least at some point in their life. Anxiety truly seems to be something that genuinely kind of goes hand in hand with that. The other thing is, and this is where I don't like where things have kind of gone with the whole empath and everybody being an empath sort of thing. Most of the time, a lot of the time, people who identify as an empath, and they're always talking about how they're an empath and how they're, it's a codependence. And what I mean is they're always needing something from other people to feel validated. So it's like, oh my gosh, I'm so sensitive, I can't go to Walmart. It's overwhelming, it's too much, it's draining. And I'm not saying that there aren't people who aren't sensitive to that degree, but I'm saying for the most part, a lot of people like that, or who sort of take on that persona. It's about in some form or another, whether they're consciously aware of it or not, I'm so special, I'm so gifted, I'm so unique. It's kind of a form of an attention getting, seeking sort of thing. And sometimes people do it and I don't think they realize that it's even coming from that place. And there are people who are just unaware, who don't realize that it doesn't have to be that way, who do suffer because they don't understand or have control over their own energy or can't manage their own energy. So that's kind of a little bit of like what this is, where it is, why sometimes I have a little bit of an issue with that. I know people seem to be, because of what's going on in the world, we're cooped up or isolated, or they're feeling the mass fear or the panic, and that's normal. You're not rogue, you don't have some sort of superpower, unless you use it in a way to do super things, you know what I mean? In one way, it's not a superpower at all, but in another way, if you're using it for the benefit of others, then if you want to view it as a superpower, that's completely up to you. But, you're not a special snowflake. You're unique just like everybody else. Why are we sensitive? Most people are just like, this is like the way that I am. I don't know, it's just the way that it is, or I'm just, super, I don't know, I have a high vibration, whatever they want to say. But there are some interesting research being done into sensitivity, especially in a spiritual capacity. One thing is, we can kind of look at it from the perspective or the point of view of like emotional contagion. We see this, like an example, like a baby starts to cry, and then the other baby's like, well, this baby's upset and they're crying, I'm going to be upset and I'm going to start crying. Or it's, I guess you could kind of call it like the same thing as mob mentality. So there is, I think, a little bit of, for those who are more aware, maybe more of a susceptibility to emotional contagion. There's also been research being done to this idea of what's called mirror neurons, and or some people have called it like the compassion neuron, which is basically when we register something within someone else, and don't ask me how, the neurons within our own brain, within our awareness, start to kind of match that or entrain to that in some way. There's different theories as to why. For example, the brain gives off an electromagnetic field, the heart gives off a very strong electromagnetic field. Is that the source of communication? Who knows? It makes sense though if you think of the aura around a human body as an electromagnetic field, and if you're working psychically, we know that we're working from an aura to aura, energy to energy place. So that's another thing that kind of goes along with that. There's also what's called mirror touch synesthesia, and synesthesia is basically, it's kind of a condition where our perceptions and our senses get mixed together. So some people who identify as synesthetic, they may taste words or see sound or smell numbers. It's like the matrix, the senses get matrixed together. Mirror touch synesthesia is basically this idea of sort of these senses being triggered and mirroring other people, where we sort of pick up that signal if I understand it correctly, and perhaps I don't. Like I said, I'm not a neuro expert or a brain expert or a physics expert or anything like that by any means, but I will definitely share with you some of those sources there. Now, I kind of wanted to talk about some of the physical and mental effects of being or allowing ourselves to be sensitive to such a degree. On a physical level, a lot of times people who identify as empathic or sensitive or intuitive, we can deal with things like fatigue, adrenal burnout. There seems to be a lot more autoimmune sort of things amongst people like that, depression, fibro, and as I mentioned, like hypoglycemia. On more of the mental and emotional level, I think that sometimes we're more prone to things like phobias, anxieties. I think I mentioned depression, but depression can experience physically as well as mentally and emotionally, burnout, mood swings, OCD, things like that. But one thing that I want to say is, even if you are the most sensitive person in the world and who feels like a live wire, and Lord knows I used to be that when I was younger, I didn't know any better, I didn't understand why things were happening to me. Crowds were overwhelming, loud noises were overstimulating. I would physically take on the pains of other people, and on some level it was because I didn't understand that I could control it. On another level too, it's that codependence thing. It's like you feel validated, you feel special, you feel unique, you feel, gifted in some way, and so some piece of us kind of, even though not consciously, continues to plug into other people and other scenarios in that way, because it sort of makes us feel unique. And who doesn't like to feel unique? And who doesn't like to feel special? So one thing that I always tell people, no matter how sensitive you find yourself, or where you're at sort of within your own understanding of things, there are no victims. There are only willing participants. And I mean that on the level of energy. Obviously, people get victimized physically in the world all the time. But on the level of energy, there are no victims. There are only willing participants. If you're experiencing something energetically, emotionally, empathically, on some level or another, you're saying yes to it. So partially, it could be because you're way too open, or you opened up way too fast, in which case I would recommend being grounded, doing things that are very grounding. And I'm not talking about closing your eyes and picturing your feet going down into the earth and becoming roots. I mean, you could do that in a pinch. That's a band-aid. The real remedy to that is to live groundedly, think groundedly, be grounded in everyday life. Do things that engage the physical world, not just mentally try to picture everything in your life right. Because we're body, mind, and spirit. If you're doing something with the mind, that's great. The mind is powerful, but you have to pair it with actions in the physical world as well. The other thing too is, sometimes I think it would behoove us to realize that energy is just information. And so if you are finding yourself in a state, or worked up, or anxious, or whatever it may be, first thing is ask yourself, is this from me, or am I sponging this from somewhere else? Get that piece of information first. Sometimes just understanding that it's coming from somewhere else is the first step in getting it under control. The second thing is, what does this tell me? If you're experiencing stomach pains and you don't really feel like it's yours, you feel like maybe it's something that you're taking on empathically or psychically or energetically or whatever, okay, why am I picking this up? What is this about? Is this trying to tell me something? Am I supposed to share something with this person? Don't get caught in feeling like you have to go up and approach random people, because that's ego too. But what is the information behind it? Is there a message behind it? What can I do with the information that I cover underneath it? The other thing is, you can only absorb what you haven't healed within yourself. And I don't mean this in the way of the spiritual bypassing, platitude, projection of condescending bullshit that you see in spirituality a lot of the times, where people are like, well, if you have a problem with it, then it's something within you that needs to be healed, and it's not about me. There's always a level of truth to that, but sometimes people are just dicks. And so we know, but nobody likes to, be around a dick. So I think sometimes it's a bit of a scapegoat that people use when they'd rather not truly look at themselves. But what I mean by this, and I'll give you an example, I was doing this class one time, and one of the girls in my class was having a really hard time letting go of the fact that she wasn't just a victim of her empathy, and that she had any sort of control over it, and kind of really liked the idea of the title of being an empath, the specialness of it. This girl, this woman's sister, was dealing with an autoimmune issue, and she was confused because she felt like she was taking on things from her sister and wasn't sure if she actually was having a similar autoimmune thing, or if this was more energetic in nature. And the first thing in an instance like that is people that we are more emotionally close to, we're always going to be more susceptible to be energetically influenced by them and emotionally influenced by them. It's that compassion, it kind of forms a cord of connection. So that's always going to be a little bit harder to manage. We have to be really firm with our boundaries in that case. Which brings me to another point. People who feel like a victim of their sensitivity don't really usually have good boundaries. People who have good boundaries in the physical world, who aren't afraid to speak their truth, who aren't afraid to say, hey, you know what, I don't feel like doing this, or I do feel like doing this, or and saying yes when they want to say yes, and no when they want to, when they want to mean no, and speaking up when something makes them uncomfortable. Those are usually people who are less affected energetically, because as above, so below, as within, so without. It's all a reflection of the other. So if you have good boundaries in the physical world, your energetic boundaries are naturally going to be better. So for those of you who feel like you're constantly picking things up and you can't help it, and you're doing all this stuff to try to manage it and be grounded and be practical and be in alignment, look and see, are there any areas in your life where you need to assert better boundaries? Because that will also help you with your emotional and empathetic boundaries as well. But anyways, I digress. One of the things I said to the girl is, when she said you can only absorb what you haven't healed within yourself. She's like, well, how do you heal like an autoimmune disease? That's a big order. And I want people to understand it's not about, in that case it just happened to be a physical issue, but it's not about healing symptoms. In this case, like I said, we are talking about something physical, but it could be an emotional symptom, a mental symptom, a spiritual symptom. It's what's underneath that symptom. It's what's underneath the experience of it. So I said to her, it's not about like you have to physically heal yourself in order to not sponge things from this person, to know the difference if it's really you or really her or whatever. But it's like, okay, look at someone who maybe does have like an autoimmune issue. And if someone was experiencing, issues with digestion and pain and fogginess and confusion, or any of the things that could go along with that, it's not about healing that, but how would that feel? People in that position would probably be angry, frustrated, resentful, scared. And we all have an angry part of ourselves. We all have a resentful part of ourselves. We all have a frustrated part of ourselves. We all have fearful parts of ourselves. And of those parts of ourselves, are there any that really stand out to us the most that maybe we can work on a little bit more consciously? And that may help as we address those things within ourselves and take responsibility for us not to be so prone to sort of suck that up from other people. So that's kind of what I'm saying there. So I want to talk about some coping mechanisms, some coping strategies for people who are sensitive. And so the first thing that I said is all about being grounded, living groundedly, engaging the physical world, making sure that we have equal attention between body, mind, and spirit. Super important. Most people in the spiritual realm are way too in the mind and way too in the spirit, neglect the body. People who we might think of as like muggles, they're way too focused on the body or the mind, they neglect the spirit. Equal. So with grounding in a physical way, one of the ways to really sort of ground ourselves is to exercise. It's to move our body. It's to engage our physical body. Yoga, going for a walk, stretching, running, lifting weights, all of those things are great. You could also do something a little bit more passive that's physical, like getting a massage. That's a great sort of self-care kind of thing as well. Now, one of the sources, as I was doing some research with this, was Dr. Judith Orloff, who is a medical intuitive, but also a medical doctor, I believe. And one of the things that she was recommending for people who are experiencing burnout, and I give this with the preface of I'm not a medical practitioner, I can't prescribe, I can't diagnose, always check with your own physician, check your sources, check your research, all that sort of stuff. Recommended vitamin C, 2,500 to 5,000 milligrams a day for short periods of time. As I said, research that at your own discretion because I can't speak to the legitimacy of that. She also recommends testing your cortisol levels because when someone is under stress, the body produces more cortisol, makes us basically fat and cranky. So you can have those checked as well. Himalayan salt is really grounding. I guess she kind of recommends incorporating it into your diet, the edible parts of it, or the way in which it's presented in stores where some are like in the bath section, but some are in the cooking section. Ingesting that, I think, probably has to do with the high mineral concentrations within it. And of course, if you're like me, I love a good bath, so soaking in that salt on a spiritual level is supposed to be very cleansing anyway, so kind of helps clear any sort of funk we might have picked up within the auric field. The other thing is eating grounding foods. If you tend to be off in the ethers a lot, things that have more of a density to them, like red meats, can be very grounding. If you're not a fan of meats, or if you're a vegetarian or vegan, things like root vegetables that kind of grow under the ground, potatoes, carrots, I don't know, do beets grow under the ground? But things like that tend to be really grounding as well. And emotionally, what do we do if we're finding ourselves maybe in a place where we're experiencing oversensitivity? One, hopefully by incorporating some of these techniques into your life, it will prevent you from being in that state of overstimulation or empath overload, however you want to look at it. But we're all going to have moments where we slip up and, you know, we experience something and we're like, oh shit, I'm in the moment now, what do I do? Breathing deep, obviously, is going to anchor you to your own body. Breath is incredibly cleansing, focusing, concentrating. Brain games can be a good distraction. Things that are like engage, especially the left brain, because that's more logical. Right brain is where we get more into our senses. So brain games, puzzles, teasers, that sort of thing can be really good. One thing that I tell people is what I call name the object. Breathe, feel your body, and then just look around your space and just start physically naming out loud what you see. As I'm breathing, I see, okay, a gold bottle over here. There's a green lamp with a black lampshade sitting on the black pedestal table. There's a chest of drawers in front of me. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 drawers to it, and that just kind of takes you out of the charge of things and engages you into the physical world that's actually around you. Showers and baths, very cleansing. If you can go, just shower it off. I know lots of people like to do visualizations and things with cleansing light and cleansing water and that sort of stuff. I think too, people who are incredibly sensitive, spending time alone is really important, but it's a bit of a catch-22 when a lot of people have codependent patterns who are sensitive because they don't like to be alone, because that means having to feel what they don't want to feel. And it's usually their own stuff that they don't want to feel, so they get distracted by allowing themselves to be bombarded with other people's stuff that they also don't want to feel. So being and sitting with your own issues and your own baggage will really benefit you in the long run. Alone time, solitude, I think is so healthy and so important. And also, sometimes we just need to, everything is so like accessible and available. Get off Facebook, turn off the news, shut off CNN, you know, put your phone on silent and just disconnect from people for a while. I think that's a really sort of important thing. So that is that. Another thing that I wanted to talk about, a technique that I think is really powerful, is something that I usually teach in like mediumship and clairvoyant development, but it's a process known as sitting in the power. Sitting in the power really works with the solar plexus, and whenever I see empathy, empathicness, anxieties, there's usually two places, well, one primary place I see it in the body, that's the solar plexus, and if those concerns are more survival-based, primal, instinctual, you know, lower self sort of stuff, I kind of see that within the root center, because that's all about security and stability. So it can be a little bit in both, but sitting in the power seeks to build sort of spiritual energy in that solar plexus, and of course in applying it in a mediumistic context, We're using that power as fuel to hold a vibration to communicate with the spirit world. But I kind of use this analogy. One, solar plexus is willpower, personal power, it's our boundaries as well. But one, if you were to think of yourself like photo paper, and as we build power in that solar plexus and expand and sort of blend with whatever your idea of a higher power is, it's like exposing that photo paper to light. And in this instance, instead of an image developing, spiritual talents, spiritual gifts are developed by spirit. You're providing the space for that nurturing to take place. So if you have other or additional, or if you even have those sort of spiritual gifts that you think you do, we'll allow those to grow and blossom. The difference is in a way that's healthy. If we think of the gut, people always talk about the gut is like the real seat of our immune system. Then you could kind of think of the solar plexus as the seat of your spiritual immune system. So you're building up your natural spiritual immunity to where you're not overwhelmed or internalizing other people's stuff, but you can still get the information and apply it in whatever way that you need to, understand it in whatever way that you need to, as you refine that spiritual perception. The other thing too, I want to talk about relationships kind of briefly here. Oh, and before I do that, I'm not going to take you through sitting in the power here today. There's a great 10-minute version of this meditation by Tony Stockwell. You can find that on YouTube. Martin Twycross has a good, a longer version. Helen DeVita, who you can readily find on YouTube, has that available. There's many sources for that. If you're interested, you'll find it. I would say start out doing it. You know, if it's a longer meditation, do it once a week. If it's a shorter meditation, do it 2-3 times a week. See what that does for you. See how that makes you feel. Now, with relationships, sensitive people tend to find themselves in the same sort of relationships, and often they're toxic relationships, because people who are sensitive or intuitive or empathic or whatever you want to call it, kind of carry a bit of a healer archetype, and we like broken people because on some level we think we can fix them. So we tend to get needy people or victim people. Oftentimes we will find ourselves with narcissists. There sort of seems to be a dynamic at play that's kind of universal amongst what people might call the empath and the narcissist. You've probably heard of that before, that concept kind of floating around. And we tend to get people with addictions or substance problems, things like that. Common threads I've noticed among sensitive people. Again, it's because we think we can fix them on some level or another. Can't fix them, boo. Can't fix them. You can only handle yourself. So I would just say avoid that. Be aware going into any sort of relationship what that is. Is there any of that going on? Is there any of that that's part of my attraction? Sometimes we find ourselves dealing with people who are almost like the opposite of what some people might call empathic. They're almost like a psychic vampire, so to speak, which I know that there are some people who take that literally, and there are some people who practice things like that literally. It's not my bag, it's not my interest. Most people, though, who are that way are unconscious of the fact that they're that way. They're the people who, they call you up, they want to talk about their problems, and in a 5-minute conversation, you feel like you've ran a 20-mile marathon. They just sort of suck the life out of you. It's because they haven't learned to sustain their own life force, or they don't understand their own source of well-being, and they just sort of zap it from you. I don't believe in psychic protection. I don't teach psychic protection, but there are little things that you can do to kind of help with the enforcing of those energetic boundaries. First thing is, and I see this sometimes with customers that come into where I conduct my business. Some people are just needy, and you can recognize that needy energy before they even get in the door. And if they want to engage me, just cross your arms over your solar plexus, or turn yourself where you're slightly at an angle away from them. That's something that, a simple gesture that can make a difference. You're not obligated or obliged to give anybody a hug, even family members. I know some people just suck it out of you when they do that. You don't have to do anything like that. Who cares if people think you're rude? I'd rather feel good and have people think I'm rude than feel like shit to try to appease other people. That's just me. Another thing sometimes that I will teach is I just call it the rose technique, where if someone is has an energy equality or whatever I just don't want to deal with, but I'm in a situation where I'm forced to interact with them, I simply just imagine that there's a rose hovered in midair between me and them. And it's just a visualization to help anchor my intention that my energy doesn't go past that point, their energy doesn't come the other way past that point. So play with those different things as well. There was another thing too that I wanted to share with you. And basically, it deals with, and forgive me if I get this wrong, my chiropractor friends can tell me if I get this wrong. On the back of our neck, there's a vertebrae that tends to stick out a little bit more. It's a little bit of a knot or a bump, and I believe that that's the C7 vertebra. And basically, this links to energetically, sort of the root chakra. Again, security, stability, groundedness. Now, on the sternum, you usually find, the midpoint here. It's kind of a little bony knot or bump. That's the sternum. And then behind the sternum is the thymus gland, which deals with the heart center. We've talked about how the heart center has a very strong electromagnetic field, the physical heart in itself, even stronger than the field that the brain gives off. And some people too, we tend to think of solar plexus as being the source of feeling, but other people say that that's more physical feeling, the heart is more emotional feeling. So basically, you kind of want to stimulate those points, or especially if you know that you struggle with boundaries or over energetic sensitivity, and you're going into a position that might be a little bit tricky for you to get a handle on, just spend a couple seconds kind of stimulating those points. And as you do, it's almost like you want to imagine or visualize there being kind of a tube going from one end to the other, almost like a straw, kind of diagonally through those 2 points, C7 and the thymus. And you want to breathe in through the C7 and kind of feel like you're breathing out through thymus. Breathe in through thymus, breathe out through C7, and just sort of repeat that cycle. And that's supposed to help kind of stimulate psychic, empathic, energetic, your sort of immune system, I guess, for lack of better words, your energetic immune system or your subtle immune system. There's also a technique, and I believe this is from is it Ivan Dominguez, I believe is the author's name, where this particular technique came from. It calls it the Helm of Light. And it's basically, as those points are stimulated, as you're doing that breathing, sort of imagine that each one of those points are kind of giving off their own field and sort of blending into one unified field into the space around you. As I said, I don't teach psychic protection because, one, I haven't necessarily really found it to be effective, especially if we're not doing physical or emotional actions to help anchor the energetic or visualization techniques that we're putting into place. But the other thing too is, as a spiritualist, I'm a big believer in natural law, and very much, if we're always in a place of fear or always feeling like we're going to be taking on something bad or uncomfortable from other people, and we're walking in the world with that expectation, we're just going to get more of that. So it's like the more we push against it, the more we resist it, the more kind of open the door to it anyway. So in a weird way, it's almost like kind of having to adopt the attitude and walking through the world like I'm a badass who's in control. And the more that you sort of walk in that energy, even if you're kind of faking it for a minute, eventually you'll start to know that that's true and believe it more and more. And that in itself, I think, is a really powerful state to be in. To me, that's grace, knowing that I'm exactly where I need to be at the right time, in the right moment, and that I am a divine being. And what does divinity need to be afraid of? So the last thing that I wanted to touch on here as well is your home needs to be your sanctuary. And if you're sensitive, I would definitely recommend, 1, keeping your home clean and tidy, 2, doing space clearing techniques regularly. I don't care if you're smudging with herbs. And I think for those who are energetically sensitive, lemongrass is a really good herb to burn or smudge with. It's very sort of psychically cleansing, so is basil. Rosemary. Those are just a few of my favorites that I like to use. Some people find benefits from salt lamp, having salt lamps in and around their home. Diffusing things like essential oils, if that's up your alley or that's more your speed. Cedar, lemon, lavender, very grounding, very emotionally calming, very cleansing kind of things to do. Is your home overstimulating? Are there too many colors that clash? Are there too many patterns? You know, I think especially with bedrooms, the simpler the better, or the rooms that you spend the most time, so you can kind of process things that you may have picked up and release them, especially as you sleep. So those are just a few things to keep in mind. I do hope that this was helpful for you or insightful for you in some way. I'm sure there's a ton of stuff that I missed that I normally talked about. I guess I'm not going to go into the trigger thing. One thing that I will say, I could maybe go into a meditation, but I know videos get way too long, people don't finish them. If you have a background with hypnosis or understand the mechanics of hypnosis or even just deep meditation, take yourself into a deep place where you experience deep calm. And then you want to give yourself some sort of an anchor, some sort of a trigger. So it could be a code word, it could be something as simple as crossing your fingers or touching your pinky and your thumb. And in that altered state, kind of anchoring and reinforcing this belief every time that I, touch my two fingers together or think of the word blue or touch my third eye or whatever it is, I will immediately experience this state of calmness and control. And just keep reinforcing that on a periodic basis. So if you find yourself in a place where you are in an emotionally charged or an empathetically charged or an energetically overwhelming sort of situation, and you're like, well, shit, we're in it, you can do that, or whatever it may be, to kind of help bring you back to your body and process those things. So again, I hope this was helpful. Stay calm, wash your hands, have a good rest of your weekend.